Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Web Platform Podcast. Episode number 175. Today we're talking about Gatsby.js. We are your hosts this week, Justin, Leon, and Danny. Leon, Danny, hello.
Hey.
Hello, Justin.
It's a Thursday this week as the recording goes, and I'm looking forward to the weekend because maybe then I'll get to, do something weekend-oriented. I don't know what that is at this point, whatever the kids want, but so close, so close. Before we introduce our guest this week to talk about Gatsby, I'm going to throw it over to Leon, who's going to talk about This Week in the Web in 2 minutes or less. Leon.
Thanks, Justin. Just a few things this week. So first of all, Firefox 63 has now actually been released. And as we said in a previous episode, that actually includes full bug component support. So that's out there now, which is really good to see. A few days ago, Chrome 70 was also rolled out, and this is a big release. It's got lots of features such as PWAs for Windows and Linux, the credential management API, and also the ability to name web workers, which is pretty cool. Also, a few days ago, version 7 of Angular was released. This is a major release, and that includes loads of new features and improvements like Shadow DOM v1 being enabled, further performance improvements, and much, much more. So check out the link to find out what is in Angular v7. And finally, the relative time format API, which is coming to Chrome 71, basically allows you to do date formatting similar to what like Moment provides. So you're able to format things, and so a date says something like yesterday or in 3 months, and you won't need any third-party libraries to do that. Use the platform. So that's everything from me for This Week in Web. Thanks, Justin.
Thank you, Leon. I was really excited about the web component stuff for Firefox, and then relative time format was there, and then my bundle size could go down, I figure, in 71. So there's so many good things to look forward to as we roll into the holiday season.
Yeah, really exciting stuff.
Anything that makes dates easier, like, immediately jumps to the top of my things to be excited about list.
Dates are horrible. Like, just
why do we
terrible.
even have those silly things?
I just look at the sun and hope it's 7 o'clock. I don't know. That's a bad way to do dates. But it's about as I'm a sundial. That's how good at telling time I am. But we're not here to talk about time today. Today we're talking about Gatsby, and let's welcome our guest this week, Jason. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
For those out there in the world of things, Jason, who don't know who you are, tell the web a little bit about yourself.
I am a developer advocate and engineer at Gatsby, which is a kind of a modern React-based framework for building super high-performance websites and apps.
Succinct, to the point. Jason, how long have you been working on the web? You've been working on the web for quite a long time at this point, yeah?
Yeah, I got my start way back in the day editing MySpace pages in around the 2001, 2002. And built websites for my band throughout the years. And I've been working professionally since about 2004, I think.
MySpace, the land where it was kind of like GeoCities, but slightly worse. Like it was so close, but man, it really did bring people to just sort of the power of what the web could be. I think we discount MySpace sometimes when we think about all the things that actually got built in the MySpace era of things.
I've met a surprising, like I used to say that as a joke, like, oh yeah, I got my start building MySpace pages. And then I've realized by making that joke that a significant number of developers who are in my age range are in the exact same boat. They started learning web development because they wanted to customize their MySpace page.
And it's the little things. It's the little things like that. I like hearing those stories because a lot of times you hear people who think, oh, I have to come from, XYZ background to be able to do this thing. And I don't have that experience. So I can't build things on the web. And that's just not true. Like everyone comes from their own background of things, whatever sort of tickled their fancy to, find that exploration curiosity. And I just love hearing those stories. Everyone's got that great sort of epiphany story.
Absolutely.
So speaking of epiphanies, Gatsby. What is Gatsby for those out there who don't know? Obviously, we know it's sort of built on top of React, but Gatsby in 90 seconds. Like, what is it?
Okay, so Gatsby is a lot, but the super high level version is that Gatsby is kind of a content mesh. And what we mean by that is that we can consume data from basically any backend. So whether that's a REST API, your WordPress site, Shopify, Excel sheets, whatever you got, we'll take that and we move it all into a centralized data layer. Then we let you build with a standardized React workflow, the same React workflow that you've always worked with, assuming you work with React. And at the end, we build all of that, the data and the components, into these highly optimized static assets that you can then host on a CDN like Netlify or AWS or and whatever CDN you want to put it on. And then it rehydrates once you've loaded in the browser into a completely fully functional web app. So this is kind of a big deal from a lot of perspectives because it gives you all the benefits of a static site generator where you get these really tiny bundle sizes, extraordinarily cheap hosting, really, really good performance. And it also gives you all the benefits of having an extremely robust backend because we can consume data from anywhere. You're not just limited to Markdown and whatever custom stuff you put together. It's kind of supported out of the box. There's a whole suite of APIs built to make that easy. And then beyond that, we kind of focus on performance. One of our biggest things is this idea of make the right thing the easy thing. So we want to make the best decision that developers can make for their users. We want to make that the happy path. If you decide to be lazy and take shortcuts, we want you doing the easiest possible thing in Gatsby to result in the best possible experience for the user. And we've engineered it to be that way.
So what kind of developer does Gatsby target? So obviously there's React does a lot already, etc. So kind of who's Gatsby for?
I mean, Gatsby is really for anyone. So for example, I just did a live stream a couple weeks ago with a woman named Katie, and Katie had done very limited React work and had never used Gatsby. And inside of about an hour and a half, we were able to get a full site built with like dynamic pages generating, and she had a blog running, all that stuff. We've also seen people who are extremely seasoned developers building just incredible apps. And it cuts down their cycle time because they don't have to think about performance optimization and all the Webpack tuning and those things that tend to take a lot of time when you get to the shipping stage of an app. And that's kind of our goal. So yeah, really anybody who's comfortable with JavaScript and willing to use React is going to be capable of building out a great site with Gatsby.
So you did mention that. So you mentioned that Gatsby is you build Gatsby applications with React. I'm curious. So there are some other things mentioned about like some data layer, just the overall way that the whole thing works. What does the full stack of Gatsby look like? Is it is it using anything else fancy, or are you pretty much, because you mentioned static site generation, but it seems like it's quite a bit more than that.
Yeah. So under the hood, Gatsby has Webpack, Babel, React, the latest version of React. We've got GraphQL in there. What else are we using? We're really built on the shoulders of giants. Like we use kind of the latest and greatest, and then what we're aiming to do is turn that into a kind of a zero config editing experience. One of the greatest things about the web, we talked earlier about GeoCities. When you used to build stuff for GeoCities, you would open a text file on your computer and you would make some edits, save it as .html, and you could open that in your browser and see those results immediately. That's not possible with most modern build stacks. You have to, in order to see your changes, you can't just open a file, type some code, and then see it on the browser. You have to set up a build pipeline, do all this configuration tuning and all these other like really challenging and advanced steps. And so we wanted to get back to the point where you would be able to just open a browser and see your changes live. And with Gatsby, you can do that. You do have to install a CLI, unfortunately, because nothing can be as simple as just opening a text editor. But once you build a new site with our CLI, you hit Gatsby develop, and then you edit a file and you'll see your changes in the browser in real time. And that's thanks to this kind of really advanced modern stack that we're built on. We just kind of pre-configured it with, like I said, making the right thing the easy thing. The best possible options for most people, we have made those, we have opinions. So we made those decisions so that you would get the best benefit right out of the box.
And I think that's a really important point when you say that you want to make the easiest, you want to make the easiest option for the developer the most beneficial for the final end user.
Mm-hmm.
And I know we've on this show have talked about before, but it's like there's a lot of ways to do some of this stuff incorrectly, even when it comes down to which polyfills should I include, like a bunch of stuff like that. It's really easy to do something wrong that does have an impact on the end users. A lot of times, like just in terms of how quickly your site loads.
Exactly.
And then my last comment on that is I do think it's interesting to hear you talk about things like GeoCities and MySpace and how easy it was to do that stuff, and that it is taking a lot more technology to actually get back to how simple that was.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, it's a good and a bad thing, right? Because we need progress. The HTML authoring experience back in the GeoCities days was extraordinarily easy to start. You would open a file, you would edit, and then things would go. But as that scaled beyond even like a single page, if you had 2 pages on your site, now you had all this duplicate HTML. So if you wanted to change the navigation, you had to copy paste that between files. And that's a horrible experience. Nobody, it inevitably, I don't know if you remember this, but I remember clicking around sites and you could like watch the progression of the site because they'd only update their homepage. So you would go to the homepage and then you would click to about and you'd see the previous version because they hadn't gotten around to like copy pasting their styles over. And then you would like click a link from the about page and see the version before that one because they forgot that page existed. And so it was just some like ancient version of the design. That's a bad authoring experience. It led to really inconsistent web experiences. It was extremely difficult when you got into like large scale apps, like professional companies with hundreds or thousands of pages. There was just really no way for them to manage these sites effectively. So the tooling that we've got solves these later stage problems. Like I have multiple pages. I need to be able to share code. I want to dry things out. But unfortunately, it creates this hurdle for beginners where a beginner can't just open the browser and type something and see their hello world in one step. So this is kind of where we're trying to find a balance. How can we give you all of those tools? How can we give you all of the power to go and build something that's going to scale, that's going to stay healthy over time and not lead to these horrendous maintenance issues later? But also just let somebody make 1 or 2 steps and then instantly start seeing things in the browser, and that's kind of a driving philosophy for us.
With so many backend sort of connections that Gatsby can utilize to sort of fill in the gaps of that story, because a lot of times we, like you said, like you try to dry things out, but fundamentally you do have all these different sort of moving pieces that make up particularly very large scale sites where you have thousands upon thousands of pages. Do developers find that the backend sort of integrations that Gatsby offers are sort of an easy way to start with that base sort of stuff and then deal with sort of the aftermath of it? Because having come from some of those systems are not the cleanest thing in the world when it comes to backend integrations. And I'm just curious how that looks within the Gatsby ecosystem. So
the Gatsby ecosystem is designed to normalize that. So what you'll see is that when you import from, say, a REST API, what we'll do is we'll consume that REST API and then we'll turn it into GraphQL nodes. And this has been a really powerful way for developers to kind of build scalable front ends, because what it means is that no matter where the data came from, once you get it into Gatsby, you use it the same way. For example, this is really, really useful for agencies because agencies are dealing with clients that have opinions about where their data lives. They've always used Drupal, or they've always used, Magento, or whatever it is. And fortunately, all of these like major content management systems are shifting to this concept of being headless CMSs, which means that they don't necessarily enforce their UI management schema. You can just say, I want to use Magento to manage my shop, but I want to access the data that Magento manages through a series of APIs. WordPress does this, Drupal does this. It's, there are whole classes of CMSs that are exclusively headless. Like Contentful is a good example of that. They don't even bother with UI. They just provide an API so that you can get at your data and do whatever you want with it. So if you're in an agency and your clients are coming to you with existing data, it's a really, really hard fight to go to your client and say, hey, we want to migrate all of your content from this platform to the other platform because we can give you a better web experience if you're using this other platform. If you're an agency and you use Gatsby, it doesn't matter where that data comes from. You have your whole set of tools of shared components, design systems, pre-existing interactions that are kind of like forms and all the stuff that you would typically kind of you don't want to reinvent those wheels for every project. You've got that built, and you know that the data is always going to come out of Gatsby in a very particular way, which means that the editing required to shift your sales page that you would use for, say, a WordPress backend versus one that you would use for a Contentful backend is really minimal. You're editing a couple names in the query, and ultimately you're getting exactly the same results. So from a front-end authoring standpoint, this is a way to kind of unify all of your data. That's why we call it a content mesh. It's this idea that we're removing this really hairy step of front ends needing to understand back ends and have this tight coupling. Instead, we're abstracting that. The back ends just have to tell Gatsby, which is a very rigid API, how to consume their data. And then the front ends, which are typically very fluid about the way they use data and they'll evolve over time, they have this really descriptive language in GraphQL to say, I want this data, but not this data. And they just say, give me whatever I need and then use it. And that stays uniform between whatever backend is there. That gives you a lot of power as a developer to kind of forget about implementation details and focus on building the best possible web experience that you can.
There is a lot of power in that abstraction, I think. I think we sometimes get bogged down in those implementation details as developers, particularly when you're just trying to get something shipped. And if you can smooth those things out, it goes a long way to focusing on basically what end users really want, which is a very clean experience, a very fast experience. And Gatsby's sort of layering of that seems to make that very simple.
Mm-hmm. That's our goal, at least.
Do you find that Gatsby's use as it's grown, because Gatsby's grown quite a bit. You all just released version 2, which brought forth a lot of performance improvements, as well as some new features. Do you feel like the ecosystem is growing pretty quickly at this point?
Yeah, the ecosystem is exploding, which we love. Our community is absolutely stellar. We have been I think we're like over 500 plugins now in our ecosystem. We have people contributing starters all over the place. We're seeing headless CMS solutions are starting to specifically target Gatsby as a deployment target because it is it's like, in their opinion, the best way to get their content to the web. And so that has been extremely encouraging. And so we're at this point, we've kind of shifted from, originally it was, hey, let's go make people aware of Gatsby. And now we're shifting our focus to, let's make sure that the people who come are extremely well supported and they feel like they belong here. We want our community to be extremely welcoming and extremely open and supportive, so that when people come in, they not only have access to this ecosystem of plugins, but they have access to this ecosystem of supportive people who want to help them succeed in their projects. And that's been a pretty big one for us.
I suspect also, having being based off of React, there's a whole huge community there as well to kind of help kind of kickstart things as well. So it's really good to hear that things are growing. On the React thing, you mentioned that Gatsby is based off of like the latest version of React. Mm-hmm. Is the version of React something that Gatsby developers can choose, or is it kind of baked into the Gatsby side of the framework, and how does that kind of work?
So it is possible to use a different version of React. We have plugins that will let you do that. We do bake it into the framework though. So typically we just work to get the latest version available. I think there's a plugin that if you need to like roll back to a certain version, you can. But one of the great things about the React kind of ecosystem is that they work so hard on backward compatibility that you very rarely need an older version of React, unless your code base is really old or has very, very specific requirements. You typically can use the latest version of React, and the worst you're going to see are some build time warnings that say like, someday we might remove this.
Yeah. What about when newer versions of React are available? How long does it take you to kind of bring those latest changes into Gatsby?
Typically, well, so with the release of Gatsby version 2, that was kind of a major modernization of Gatsby. Prior to that, we were on Webpack version 1. We jumped up to Webpack version 2. We had been on React 15, I think, and we moved up to the latest version of React. So we're hoping that iteration time goes down significantly moving forward. The biggest problem is like React minor versions are no problem because they don't introduce breaking changes. When we introduce breaking changes, then it requires like major releases, which is a huge kind of update cycle. So we're trying to be mindful of how often we introduce major breaking changes into the Gatsby library. But outside of that, we did, for example, with version 1, there was a plugin that would let you use the latest version of React with Gatsby version 1. We just weren't quite ready to break the API for people who are on the older versions of React just yet.
That makes a lot of sense. And just out of curiosity, are there any plans to kind of bring other frameworks to Gatsby?
So, no, I mean, so officially, no. Like to just kind of not beat around the bush, there are no official plans to, for example, support Vue. However, the way that Gatsby is built, there are hooks that exist so that you can do things like, for example, MDX is a version of Markdown that allows you to insert React components. And in order to make that work, we have internal hooks that allow you to kind of swap out renderers and swap out different pieces of the Gatsby core to make something work differently than the Gatsby core does. So in theory, you could, if somebody in the community wanted to do it, you could build a Vue site and then build the transpiler that would make it compatible with Gatsby. Whether or not that effort would be worth it, or whether or not there are enormous unseen problems in making that happen, I don't know, because like I said, we haven't really researched it. But yeah, so short answer is no.
It is interesting to hear that you have those types of hooks exist, though, and I'm curious what folks have tried.
So the biggest thing is that we do kind of on the fly AST modification, abstract syntax tree. So we take the code and we break it down into its component pieces, like what the compilers are actually going to read, and then we make some adjustments during the build process of the code. For example, our GraphQL. You write the GraphQL as if it's going to run on the client side, but we do this at build time. So we call it early binding of data. And that means that we're actually going to go into the components, find the GraphQL queries and like remove them entirely from the AST during compile time and insert the data. So what that means is that you could, in theory, take a Vue component. So actually, let me explain it from the MDX standpoint. And I'm not super computer sciencey, so I apologize to anybody who knows this better than I do, and I feels like I'm butchering this. But the way that this works is like we take the MDX components, and when they get extracted into the AST, then using these hooks, you're able to kind of insert the MDX parser to find these React components and inject the kind of the compiled stuff and turn that all into a combination of Markdown and React that can then be fed to the rest of the Gatsby process. So what that means is that like really anything that can be parsed down to an AST, you could do the transformations to turn it into something that Gatsby could understand. What I'm not sure about and what we haven't looked into is the level of complexity involved in making a conversion from like the Vue component AST to a Gatsby compatible, which would mean React compatible AST. And presumably it's not super feasible because I imagine that would already exist if it was easy.
Still interesting.
Sounds like a weekend project.
You're looking for something to do at the weekend, Justin.
I was earlier in the podcast. How did you know, Leon?
I mean, it would be a really powerful thing if it would be like a Rosetta Stone if you could create that kind of like AST, the ability to move back and forth. It would change a lot of things. I imagine that the level of complexity you're going to hit really early in that process is very high, though.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like low-hanging fruit, to say the least.
I would agree with
backlog. In terms of sort of that transpiling process and everything, a lot of times people compare, everyone loves to compare something to something, whether it's apples to oranges to race cars. In terms of speed, we for small projects, it's probably, speed is probably not an unlikely problem in the sort of that transpile step. But when you start to look at lots and lots and lots and lots of pages where you're sort of doing that upfront work, what kind of speed improvements have been made? Because I know that you all worked on Hulk Smash as a pull request in there to really speed up the build for really massive sites.
Yeah, so there are two types of speed that are worth discussing. The first one is how long it takes to build the site. So when you say, when you run Gatsby build, how long does it take to pull down the data, convert this into HTML and like print out static assets? And then the other kind of speed is what's coming out for the end user. So when you ship these assets, how fast does it load in the browser? How performant is it? On the first side, build speed is like, if you take Gatsby compared to something like Hugo, we are most likely never going to compete with Hugo because Go is fundamentally better suited for static site generation than JavaScript. That being said, the work that we did in the Hulk Smash was to eliminate as many of the known bottlenecks as possible. So we did things like allow Gatsby to take advantage of all available cores instead of running on a single core, which means that for a four core computer, you should get a roughly 4x improvement on your build time. And we did a lot of little things like that. We're starting to lay the foundation for what will be kind of our next product. So Gatsby, the open source project, will always be open source. Gatsby, the company, is going to be launching some products, one of which is Preview, which we can talk about later. And then the next one that we want to build is going to be around basically providing infrastructure that is highly tuned for building Gatsby sites so that we can eliminate this class of problem entirely. This was kind of the initial step in that direction. And we saw as a result that the build times between Gatsby v1 and Gatsby v2, we reduced it by up to 75% on really large sites. That being said, Gatsby is still going to fall down if you get up above, I think right now it's somewhere between like 10 and 100,000 pages. We haven't figured out exactly where that break is because it very much depends on what type of processing you're doing. If every page that you're putting up is just, hello world, you can do a ton of pages. If every page that you're putting up has 8 backend data calls and things like that, then you see a lot of, there's additional work that's being done. And that's another reason that it's hard to make an apples to apples comparison about build speed with Gatsby versus other static site generators because, the Gatsby is doing more under the hood, which results in just, there's just more to be done, which means more work, and that slows things down. But yeah, we're hoping here we made big strides in V2. We're hoping that down the road, we're going to see even more improvements there. And, that's something that our core team is constantly focused on is build time performance.
Yeah, it's such a hard thing because you're right. I mean, a lot of people, oh, look, this one is faster than this one. But unless you take into you have to give it some context. I mean, context sort of makes the world go round when it comes to bigger builds of things. In terms of the speed on the front side of things, like you said, there's two sides to every performance story. One is the thing that as developers we like to think of as speed, which is will it build fast enough so I can get out the door at 5? Or but there is the other side of life too, which these days gets a lot more play. I know we talk about it a lot on the show and it pops up on Twitter. It seems like every weekend, but general web performance, the front end, the thing that users use and the experience they have. how does Gatsby fit into that story? Because, obviously in a framework world of frameworks should always be faster, oh my gosh, why am I seeing, the magicalness of pure orange in my trace? How does Gatsby play into that sort of story in terms of web performance?
So if you think about just kind of what a website needs to look like and all the recommendations that are being made by teams like, the Google Chrome team and the purple pattern that Adi Osmani helped popularize, and the work that's being done just kind of across the board to help developers understand how performance actually works on the front end. There are a huge amount of things that you as a developer need to consider. So when you choose your static site generator or any generator, or, any like server, whatever you're using, you typically are going to be handed a really effective way of managing that site, but also you're going to then have to manually implement all of those performance things. So if you need to implement the purple pattern, you have to sit down and implement the purple pattern. If you're going to manually set up the link rel prefetch, link rel preload, if you're going to do priority hints, which are now starting to show up in beta, if you're going to do image optimization and source sets and using all of these different techniques, lazy loading, that sort of stuff, you have to actually sit down and build all of it. And in the vast majority of cases, there's just no time. Unless you're at a huge company that can afford to dedicate multiple sprints to performance tuning or dedicate entire teams to performance, you're going to see that you'll have time to do a few of those things, but not all of them. And the ones that you do, the performance world moves fast. It's going to come up with new things that you can do very quickly. And then you have to find time to go re-implement that on top of all of the other maintenance and new feature work. So with Gatsby, what we did is we baked all of those performance considerations into the core. We expose a component called link that will do a link rel preload, link rel preload for the next page that you're looking at. And so we just load that in the background. So your next page load feels instant. We have an image component that will allow you to pull in, you take one image that's sitting in your file system completely unoptimized. We use a library called Sharp under the hood to load in that image, create multiple versions at the right resolutions, create a tiny version of it, and then wrap all that up into a lazy loaded image component so that your users get no visible blocking and no wasted data for loading that giant hero image that you just had to install because of your marketing team. We also do code splitting, really advanced code splitting. We do, optimistic prefetching. We're doing dead code elimination. All these things that are none of them individually. None of these things are hard. In Gestalt, it's a huge amount of work and a huge amount of ongoing maintenance. So what we're asking developers to do when they use Gatsby is to trust us to make those improvements, and we'll roll new performance tuning into the core as they, as they sleep, as they do their regular jobs, so that all they have to do is bump the latest version of Gatsby to get the latest recommendations on how to follow web perf. We work closely with people like Adi Osmani to figure out what we can do better so that the product we ship, if you start with a Gatsby default starter and run a webpagetest.org check on it, you're going to get straight A's and 100% on the Lighthouse exam. So we're setting you up to succeed, so that you don't have to think about performance at all. We want performance to be automatic. If you're using a different static site generator, you can 100% get to the point where you're acing your Lighthouse audit and your webpagetest.org, but all that work is going to be done on your time and with your actual labor. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I think, again, taking away some of the implementation details of where performance lies, I think, is a boon for folks who who understand that they want performance, but don't necessarily have all of the time to learn the entire stack. Because you are correct. There's a significant amount of things going on sort of in the web performance world that can be hard to keep up with. I think it's a continuing challenge to make sure that understanding how one browser operates as according to the other, understanding things like purple is going to make your life generally easier as a whole. But understanding that, why does this one thing not quite run at 60 frames a second? Or, why am I getting this sort of experience? Like, if we can make that easier for developers, I think you're always better off, because otherwise people won't go back to it. Or at least in my experience.
I mean, I kind of think about it the same way as Benedict Muir and Franziska Hellman on the V8 team. Like their team is just sitting there making V8 run faster so that we as JavaScript developers don't need to understand the performance implications of using a for each versus using a .map versus using an iterator versus a set versus a week, all these different things that effectively solve the same problem. But then we have to think about performance implications. And yes, you can go do that research, but really what the V8 team is doing is they're just finding these bottlenecks and fixing them so that they cease to exist entirely, right? So we're not doing this at the platform level. We're trying to do this at the framework level. We're trying to eliminate an entire class of concerns so that developers don't have to think about, is this the most performant way to do it? We did that for you. It's just done. You have to make an effort to break our performance tuning. So as long as you just follow our recommendations, like I said, take the happy path, do the easy thing. We will give you the best possible result for what you've got. And then we also have a bunch of tuning options and additional resources to help you learn you can learn how to do it on your own, but we want to take that out of consideration. Don't waste your mental effort on problems that can be solved automatically.
Do you all remember when there were actually there were correct ways to performantly loop through stuff? What was it? It would actually be faster if you looped through an array backwards or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a bunch of that type of I guarantee you a bunch of people have never had to think about that before. And it's something that until right now, I had also forgotten about. So I think it's really good that is such a core focus of Gatsby because it should be that way. I like the fact that Gatsby users, it's I haven't had to think about optimizing my images before because in 2 years because my tool just did it for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because that doesn't make being able to optimize an image, you should understand what's happening, but you definitely don't need to understand how. Being able to create 8 versions of the same image at different resolutions so that you can set up a source set, great. I'm glad that you did that once because you should understand fundamentally how it works. But doing that for every image on a site is an enormous waste of your time. Let a tool do that for you.
Yeah, there is that point in time, right, where tooling becomes paramount to success. You can only get so far on sort of the manual processing of things. I think a lot of times we have a tendency to forget about this and forget why people use certain types of tools, frameworks, libraries, whatever you're using to sort of get the job done, because there are actual legitimate user reasons. A lot of times when we talk about performance, a lot of times we say, well, just don't use that. And that's not very conducive to actually getting things done. People aren't going to stop using the tools that make their life easier so that they can ship things. As people who were building tools or working on the platform or some level of extraction away from the person that's delivering that end result site, we have to be cognizant of that. We have to, understand that. And it's good to see the Gatsby's has that as a core sort of thought going forward, right? Because it's hard to tack on at the end as opposed to, we've been thinking about this since the get-go.
Right, exactly. And that it factors into our company values. We did a blog post a while back at our most recent all hands meeting. So we're a completely remote company, which means that we don't see each other in person very often. So at our most recent meeting where we were all in the same room, we sat down and we wrote down what do we care about as a company? And this idea of make the right thing, the easy thing came out as one of our core values. And that's, so it informs every choice that we're making about our platform, our community, all that. It's the reason that we put so much effort into our documentation. It's the reason that we put so much effort into growing our community with pair programming and free swag for contributors and all the things that we're doing to try to get people to really feel like they belong in our community. Because that's another one of our core values is you belong here. We want you here in our community. But we're trying to make sure that it's both professionally and personally rewarding to use Gatsby as a tool. We want it to feel great on all fronts. And so that kind of informs all the decisions that we're making.
I think there's a lot of developers that really just want to, build pretty sites or great apps and great experiences. They know that they need to care about performance, and they know they need to care about all of these things we've just talked about, but it's not necessarily what excites them. So having something like Gatsby just kind of abstracts all that away so they can just focus on the stuff that they really love, like building cool stuff. I think that's brilliant, and that's a really kind of good thing to be aiming for.
Yeah, that's we 100% agree.
So in terms of features that are out there for Gatsby, obviously we've discussed it, but there's a deep repertoire of plugins. There's a lot of ongoing work around integrations. What's a feature that developers aren't using Gatsby? Because there's always those hidden gems of people like, oh, I didn't know this existed. Is there a hidden gem in Gatsby that you're like, I wish people knew more about this because it'd make their lives easier and make a nice, really experience? Does Gatsby have that thing now that you guys have hit V2 and you're like, hey, don't forget about X?
Yeah, the biggest one that we've seen is Gatsby image. So we are rewriting our docs right now to include Gatsby image, and in revamping our default starter. I think that merged actually where Gatsby image is a core part of that default starter, because we were seeing all these sites ship and they weren't actually using the image optimization. And so we were trying to figure out why. And then we went back and read the docs, and our tutorial doesn't even mention it. So we realized that we'd kind of buried one of the more, in my mind, one of the more kind of revolutionary pieces of Gatsby, which is that we completely eliminate an entire class of image optimization problems. We had just completely forgotten to mention it. So we're in the process of rectifying that. But for now, to anybody who's got a Gatsby site, like, check if you're using Gatsby image. And if you're not, like, start. It's going to make a huge difference.
In terms of, I mean, we've talked a bit about images at this point, but it seems like one of those things that people have a tendency to forget about. When we start to ship images on the web, especially since we have source set and picture and everything. Anything that makes images easier, as far as I'm concerned, everyone should look at, because those images that most people ship are just, it drags down the overall experience. Do look at your image plugins, folks. Even if you're not using Gatsby, if you're out there listening, check to make sure the things you're shipping are performant on the image size. Everyone will be happier. Trust me, it'll be a much happier experience.
Yeah, and like look at tools that will do this for you. Like I'm blanking on the name right now, and I feel like a jerk. They'll do on the fly API based image optimization for you, so that you don't have to do it. We're in the process of working on a plugin for Gatsby so that you can also integrate the two, so that you don't have to host your images locally as well. Lots of really, really easy ways to make your images great, and they don't require a lot of work. So to just echo what Justin said, like, focus on your images.
Beyond the image side of life today, you all have a CLI. So obviously we've sort of alluded to it in the notion of that, hey, you're using Gatsby to build things, and hey, there's plugins and it does magical stuff. But a lot of times, a lot of tooling ships with their own sort of command line interface now, a tool that just sort of makes and brings everything together. In a world where it seems to be driven with ginormous Webpack configurations and NPM scripts sort of tied with ribbons or wire or random bits of string that people find to make them all work. How much effort do you all put into your CLI? Because it strikes me as one of those things that if your CLI is fundamentally poor, then the experience that the end user has is generally poor too. Like, there's a lot of work that must go into that.
Yeah, our CLI is obviously a huge focus for us and something that we care about very deeply. But the goal is to, again, just kind of eliminate some of the things that make it hard to get started. So there are certain things that you just can't get rid of in modern web development. You're probably going to have Git installed on your machine, which means that you're probably going to have jumped through a few hoops to get that running. But once you've got that set up, if you've installed Node and you can install Gatsby CLI, you can just do Gatsby new, and we'll run we'll clone the repo. We'll install dependencies. We'll eliminate the old Git history so that you're not, confused about how that works. Get everything kind of set up. But the goal here is that we want our CLI experience to just feel as good as editing the site and seeing things. So, our develop process implements stuff like hot reloading and other convenience methods like running a local server. So we can do that will that'll solve a whole class of development problems that typically are just a pain in the ass. It's like, it sucks to have to do all of this manual work just to see your sites live. And our CLI is designed to eliminate as much of that manual work as we reasonably can without making it into complete magic. We don't want to turn it into something that if you had to debug it, you'd be like, I literally have no idea what any of this does. But we want to get you away from having to do manual config tuning that really no one should need to care about after it's set up the first time.
Yeah, it can be difficult I see some CLI tools that have a tendency to go too deeply into that side, where you end up in a situation where, hey, I've got this tool, but it also requires its own 55-line configuration file, as opposed to, I just want to run this thing right now. Like, let me run.
Yeah.
Which I understand. Like, I realize there's, of course, a trade-off there. Like, sometimes you need configuration, and, I have no lack of dot files, but at the same time, that can be a barrier to developers who, to Danny and Leon's point earlier, which, I just want to get work done. Like, don't get in the way of me trying to get work done or use your thing. So, that can be hard. Again, there's always that trade-off.
Yeah, there's a balance to strike, right? Because if you make something truly zero config, then it's not flexible. But if you make it 100% flexible, then it's extremely difficult to initially configure. So I think the balance that we're trying to strike is zero config by default, but every single piece of our config is ejectable and customizable. So, you can, if you want, inject your own Webpack config or Babel config or whatever you want into Gatsby and kind of use it your way. You just don't have to.
I sometimes wonder if, because I sometimes think of Yeoman and how Yeoman, to some extent, I want to say started the trend. I don't know that it actually started the trend, but I feel like it started the trend of, hey, maybe we can have things that have these simple setups. And then everyone sort of moved to, well, I'm going to gen my own CLI for, my particular world. But at the same time, it's from where we started so long ago in a web development world where so much of this you had to piece together every single time you wanted to gen something. We've come a long way to making life way simpler for everybody.
100%.
So one of the things that I wanted to make sure that we got to is, so you mentioned earlier that, Gatsby will be, the free Gatsby, as you know, will be free, but that Gatsby, the company, is also launching some additional products. And I was curious if you could talk to us about what some of those offerings are.
Sure.
Or will be.
Yeah. So the current offerings are, we're doing the typical services thing. So if you want to have the Gatsby core team consult with your company on your Gatsby site, architectural code review, whatever, we're open to that. And the other one is currently in a closed alpha, hopefully moving to beta soon. We're launching a product called Gatsby Preview. And what Gatsby Preview does is it reintroduces the concept that CMSs have that you lose with standard static site generators. And that is that when somebody who's not a developer needs to edit content, they would like to see that content in preview before they commit it, before they actually hit publish and send it live. And that is really easy to do with something like WordPress and really difficult to do with a static site without running it locally. So rather than asking all of our content managers to download, the repo and run Gatsby develop so that they can edit content and see the changes, we are launching a product that allows content managers to, see a live preview of their content on a develop-ish instance of the site at a private URL so that they can share it around for feedback and they can see their content in situ before they actually take it live. So that's the big one. That's really useful for agencies, for people who are managing clients. We'll have more. There are details about that on our blog. We'll have significantly more details once it goes into beta. Then we're going to launch something that we haven't named yet, but it's going to be built around the idea of cloud-based builds of Gatsby. And the goal there is that we're going to take advantage of a lot of really hardcore infrastructure. This is stuff that I don't personally work in, but we've got some super smart people working on like Kubernetes setups, and we've got Kafka running to do event sourcing. And the whole goal is that we're trying to get to this model of static builds that happen as fast as a server-side render. So we don't exactly know what the details are going to be, and I wouldn't even pretend to be able to comprehend a lot of what's going on under the hood. But the goal is that when you are building your Gatsby sites, we want to be able to let you as the customer make a change to even a 1 million page site and see those changes in near real time. So, you know, that's the product that we're working toward. And that's the one that that's a little ways out because we're still trying to get preview out the door.
I have heard of a Kafka and a Kubernetes before.
That's pretty much as I've heard of.
But that sounds pretty cool. And I'm always fascinated, and I think I bring this up whenever we have somebody on the show in this type of situation where you know, like you think about Ionic and the way that Gatsby work, where you take an open source project and you do manage to turn it into a company that, you know, makes, you know, money for people that pays folks. I always think it is really interesting when those things work and they work well. And I'm always curious as to what, you know, like what types of things will people pay for versus the things that they expect for free. It's really, really cool.
Well, I think, I mean, especially in open source, and this is now just my personal opinion on this, but the model that seems to work well and the model that resonates with me is like open source is always free. So you can't do like a hobbled version of open source where some of the functionality works, but you got to pay for the rest of it. But what you can do is you can take a successful open source project, keep it healthy, and like put a huge amount of your effort into expanding and improving the open source free piece out there. And then to the side of it, things that aren't free to manage, like for example, this preview service, that's a hosted service. It requires infrastructure. It requires servers. And anybody could build what we're building. The difficulty isn't in the technical part of it. The difficulty is in managing it and keeping it live and figuring out how to do access management and stuff. So we're taking this stuff that is a pain and that costs money, and we're bundling it up into a managed service so that you can eliminate that stress and that overhead of having to manage that service in-house. And then we're offering that for a fee. So, you know, we're in doing that. It's a value add to the ecosystem. It's not we're not limiting, we're not gating. We're not saying that like this thing that used to be free is no longer free. We're saying, here's this thing that you've been using and you like. This is a feature that we can't add to open source because it requires infrastructure and hosting, but we will offer it for a fee. And if it's something that's valuable to you, then you can opt in to use it. And otherwise, you know, you can kind of take our model and build it in-house and manage it on your own. And we kind of see that being the path forward for open source projects, or I see that being the path forward for open source projects. Find an ecosystem and then improve that ecosystem. And part of improving the ecosystem includes putting out some paid services that for the people who make money from the ecosystem, it's worth their time. It adds enough value to their workflow, to their client relationships, that paying for a service it's a good deal for them. They get enough value to make it worth it.
Very cool.
So we're just about out of time as we round out episode here, number 135. Jason, is there something that we forgot to ask you that we should have asked you that people should know about Gatsby, or just anything you want to talk about?
A couple things that I'd like to leave with are just the fact that we want people in our community. So I've mentioned it a couple times, but just to reiterate, our community is completely driven, like the value of our product is completely driven by our community. And so for us, making our community as welcoming, as open, as supportive as possible is a key thing for us. So for example, we're coming up toward the end of October as we're recording, and we've been doing Hacktoberfest, right? And so we're one of the top repos on Hacktoberfest according to their stats page for just community participation. We've had hundreds of PRs closed, and we do things like give away swag to people who contribute to the repo. We offer free 1-hour video pair programming sessions with our core team to go through your Gatsby problems and to ask questions about how to get started or how to contribute. We are regularly looking for ways to support the community and to get more and more people feeling comfortable in open source. We're especially interested in trying to make open source feel welcoming for communities that traditionally haven't felt welcome in open source. So we're trying to ramp up our efforts there to get involved with groups like Women Who Code or just whoever we can to try to just make open source in particular feel open and feel welcoming. And so if you want to get involved, if you've been curious about getting involved in open source, you can reach directly out to me. You can reach out to Amberly, who is one of our, Amberly Romo is her name. She's one of our developers. You can reach out to any of the core maintainers that you're going to see around GitHub. We would love to have you as part of our community, and we'll do whatever we can to support you on that path.
Fantastic. Well, Jason, thank you so much for coming on the show today. We greatly appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for inviting me.
If people want to get in touch with you, where's the best place to ping you? GitHub, Twitter, those places?
Twitter is probably the one that I'm most likely to respond to quickly. GitHub is also a great place. Otherwise, yeah, those are the best ones.
And we'll get those in the show notes for folks. Leon, Danny, closing thoughts before we wrap up episode number 175.
Performance is important. Use tools that help you make faster, better stuff.
Very good, Danny.
Yeah, I was spot on.
Yeah.
You have that one in your back pocket?
Just thank you, Jason, for coming on the show, chatting to us. It's great to hear about all these interesting projects, and sounds like Gatsby is making the web easy to do things again.
We certainly hope so.
And with that, this has been episode number 175 of the Web Platform Podcast. Today, we've talked about Gatsby with Jason. We've listened to Leon and Danny ask questions and postulate interesting things, and I've rambled on as usual. We hope next week you join us again where we talk more things web, more things platform, and we hope you have a great rest of your week.